Hello, I'm Anavultus, and today I'm with the Prosecutor, another fellow YouTuber who has put forward an idea of post-liberalism, and today that's generally what I'm going to be inquiring about. Also, we might be getting to know each other a little bit, so feel free to ask me questions when anything interesting comes up. But first, I'd like you to introduce yourself a bit.
Hello, I'm a YouTuber. I call myself the Prosecutor in the Prosecutor channel. I identify myself as a post-liberal conservative, which is a political philosophy that is was started and is embraced largely. Well, let me back up. It's a political philosophy of which Patrick Deneen I would identify as the founder, but has acquired a small following.
Okay, so when you say post-liberal, would you first define liberal just so that we have a contrast here? Because I know that there's a number of different ways to define that.
So liberalism is not meant to refer to the left-wing political ideology. Liberalism is to refer to the philosophy that was behind the founding of the United States and was popular during the Enlightenment, associated with philosophers such as John Stuart Mill, John Locke, etc. It refers to the idea that that the purpose of a government, of the state, is to protect the rights of its citizens. How liberals view their philosophy is that absence a government, people exist in a state of nature. And in the state of nature, there's no conception of freedom or individual rights. And therefore, the formation of a government or a state is necessary for the protection of individual rights and for the fostering of freedom. So that's the basis behind a liberal philosophy. Now, when I talk about post-liberalism, or when post-liberal figures such as Patrick Deneen talk about post-liberalism, they're not referring simply to the base liberal philosophy, but they're also including in that the sort of left-wing progressive version of liberalism. Now, normally, a contrast that often gets drawn by conservatives about the left versus the right is that the right adheres to this sort of classic liberal conception, while the left are Marxist. However, that is a false distinction, in my opinion. There are some on the left who are indeed Marxist, who do indeed put equality as a first principle above freedom. However, that would be a minority of people on the left. Most people on the left, if you talk to them, they will identify themselves as a type of liberal, a more perfect version of a liberal. So, for example, if you look at inequity in the number of women who are college or at the inequity of the number of women who become physics professors, the liberal position, the leftist position would not be that we need to have a 50-50 parity of female physics professors. They will, because if that was the left-wing position, you might be in a position where you would have to force women to be physics professors, even though they didn't want to. Instead, what the left-wing progressive will tell you is that there is this sexism that exists in society that prevents women who want to be physics professors from entering the profession. So we need to engage in this sort of social justice type activity to overcome this sexism, to allow women to achieve their individual autonomy in liberalism that's promised to them by liberalism.
Yeah,
So when I say post-liberalism, I mean that I'm opposed to both the original liberal philosophy as well as the progressive reinterpretation of it.
Okay. So when you're opposed to the original liberal philosophy, would that also be included as an opposition to the Enlightenment in general, or just to liberalism and philosophies that come out of liberalism?
So let me clarify my position. It's post-liberalism, not illiberalism. It's not that I think that all vestiges of liberalism and progressivism need to be routed out and eliminated. It's that we need to reorient our society so that liberalism and progressive liberalism is not the end goal of our society. Because the problem that we've run into in the United States is that our entire society, culture, government, and institutions have been shaped in the image of liberalism. And liberalism, at the end of the day, can be interpreted as the cause behind nearly every social problem that we're currently fighting against.
Okay. So give me a little bit of an example of that.
So a perfect example of that is an issue as simple of who's going to take care of the children. So traditionally in the United States, when a child, the expectation would be that that before people would have sex, that they would be married to one another. And if a woman ended up pregnant and she was not married, then often you would have this thing sort of referred to as a shotgun wedding, where the mother and the father, would be pressured to get married. If for some reason that was not a possibility, then what would traditionally happen is that the mother and child would be sent off to live with a relative, and it would be kind of kept under wraps. So, because liberalism has basically imperialized our culture, we ended up having this thing called the sexual revolution. And in the sexual revolution, it was confirmed that, well, you are autonomous individuals. You can have sex with whoever you want on your own terms. So this created a problem where we had women getting pregnant out of wedlock. So to deal with this problem, the philosophy of liberalism basically adopted this idea. Well, families can come in any variety. If you want to be a single mother and raise a child by yourself, then that's totally your prerogative. The problem with that is that's not something that can be done in our society, because if a woman has to take care of an infant child, she cannot afford to work and support herself. And this becomes, even if, unless she is a high wage work, if she makes enough money, perhaps she can pay for a daycare for the child. But if she's a low wage worker, even if she pays for daycare, it's still not going to be enough to cover what's needed to support her. So the liberal state applies a liberal solution to this problem. It provides a welfare payment to the mother that allows her to support herself and the infant child. Now, the problem then becomes the citizens of the liberal state are become upset with this. Why am I paying tax dollars to take care of this woman and child when the man who impregnated her is contributing? He's the one who caused this problem, but he's contributing nothing to it. Instead, myself, the taxpayer, is the one stuck taking care of this child. So the liberal state acknowledges this and again applies a liberal solution. And the liberal solution is it starts engaging in mass surveillance. It now requires all employers to submit quarterly statements to the State Department of Economic Security, indicating all of the people that it employs and how much money they make. The liberal state then tracks down these fathers and files lawsuits against them. It gets the courts to order paternity tests, and assuming it establishes paternity, it orders them to pay a portion of their paycheck to a state clearinghouse. And the liberal state will always make clear to the father that if you pay the child of the mother with cash on hand, if you bypass the clearinghouse, well, we're not going to count that payment. Every payment has to come through the liberal state. Now, if the father loses his job or, falls back on payments, then the liberal state will file another lawsuit against the father and demand to know what is happening. If the liberal state finds that the father is not looking hard enough for a new job or is hiding money or something like that, then it may jail him in contempt of court. If an employer is not if, for example, the father is working under the table, then the liberal state may go after the employer. So here's just one simple aspect of our society: who takes care of the children? And it creates this massive statist bureaucracy to solve this problem. Well, I thought the purpose of liberalism was to protect freedom. But why then does it create, to solve such a simple problem, this elaborate state bureaucracy that engages in mass surveillance and which potentially holds people in jail for contempt of court for disagreeing with the liberal state? And that's just one example, but I believe our society, government, and culture faces an absolute epidemic of similar things to this.
Yes, I do have to agree on that. And I think an important point in here is the idea that the value and practical usefulness of liberty is not in liberty in itself, but is actually contingent upon certain other values. Would you agree on that?
Absolutely. I think that what passes as liberalism today is a bastardization of what liberalism meant originally in our country. And I say that to sort of explain that the liberalism that people pass off as liberalism today is really the philosophy of John Stuart Mill. It's harm principle liberalism. However, if you look back at the history of the Enlightenment, you will see a very different interpretation of liberalism. For example, we talk about a liberal education or getting a degree in the liberal arts. So, what are the liberal arts? Well, a traditional liberal art education would be to learn to study sort of the great works of ancient and medieval philosophy, the sort of philosophy that emphasized things such as virtue and stoicism. And the idea was, by learning about this ancient philosophy and also potentially studying religious works, learning debate, learning all of the traditional things of liberal arts, that you could achieve a form of personal liberation and freedom. And that freedom was the liberation of the individual from their base natural instincts. So, for example, by becoming stoic, by learning virtue ethics, no longer are you consumed with the need to acquire wealth or to satiate your sexual or appetites for food. Instead, you're focused on cultivating virtues and living up to a sort of higher standard. And the purpose of the liberal arts education was meant to be this path of liberation, this path that an individual could travel in order to free themselves from their sort of lower biological desires. And you see this, for example, in some of the mottos of universities. For example, the University of Pennsylvania's motto is "Laws without morals are useless." The motto of Ohio University is Religio Doctrina Civilitas Prae Omnibus Virtus, which is religion, learning, civility, above all virtue. So when the founding fathers talked about liberalism, yes, some of them probably did view liberalism as a John Stuart Mill style harm principle liberalism, but the founding fathers also would have recognized a type of liberalism that focused on liberating the individual from basically living their life running on a hedonic treadmill.
Okay. So, what are these higher virtues above liberty?
So the conception of virtues is that they are basically characteristics that will lead to a satisfactory life if they are pursued. So a virtue consists of a practice, in that if you follow the practice, it's not, for one, it's the ethical thing to do. It's what you should follow. And secondly, it will lead you to a sort of overwhelming position of satisfaction with your life. So as to, is there a concrete agreed upon list of these are the specific virtues that everyone agrees on? No. The virtues differ from different societies. For example, Benjamin Franklin had a list of virtues, which was not the same as Aristotle's list of virtues. And the virtues have to exist in a context of the particular time and place which they are in. But even though these lists are never exactly the same, they tend to overlap. An idea of what's common with the virtue is that it's seen as in the correct place between two extremes. So, for example, a common virtue that's recognized as being brave in the face of danger. To not be brave would be to be cowardly, which would be a vice. But to be reckless and rash, overly brave to the point where it's foolish, would also be recognized as a vice. Now, to explain the concept of why virtue will lead someone to the better life, you have to understand what I would call the false allure of the hedonic treadmill. So one way that people achieve satisfaction is through personal pleasure or the accumulation of wealth. So you can eat a delicious meal, you can consume drugs, or you can get a job promotion, and it will bring you some temporary amount of happiness. But it will only last temporarily. You have to continue to strive for that, to take more drugs, eat more food, have more sex, get more job promotions in order to keep this cycle of satisfaction going. The reason that virtue liberates an individual from this hedonic treadmill is that if you teach yourself to take satisfaction in your own personal character, in your own accomplishments, then that is something that you can be satisfied with, that can't be taken away from you. It's the one path towards a long-term sense of personal satisfaction.
Okay. So, toward that, I have a question. Why should we choose to be satisfied or happy or prosperous as opposed to the opposite? What is the values system here?
So the reason that the advantages of being a Stoic, or adopting virtue ethics, is that your your satisfaction with your own virtue is something that can never be taken away from you. So if you can imagine, let's say you come into possession of great wealth, you end up marrying a beautiful woman. um, you have all of these objects that you care deeply about. Well, all of those things could be taken away from you. You could, like perhaps thieves could steal your wealth, or your beautiful wife could leave you, or you could lose all of your objects. But if you take satisfaction in your own character and the fact that you are, you're proud of your own moral character, that can never be taken away from you.
Well, that's
Does that
not
answer your question?
well, that's not really what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, what is there any objective sense that this sort of happiness or satisfaction is in any way better or more valuable than nihilism?
Better in what regard?
Well, more valuable in an absolute sense, as in we can say that it's better to be happy than to be unhappy, for example. For what reason could you say that?
Well, I'm not sure if this will answer your question or not, but I view ethics and morality to be teleological, which means that it originates from our own human form, and that by pursuing a life of virtue, human beings achieve their telos, or their purpose, by doing so. And because the telos of a human being is to take the form of virtue, I would say that is a more worthwhile sort of life to live than one that's simply based on satiating one's natural and biological impulses.
Okay, maybe I'm getting into a bit too deep on the philosophical side of things, but in a practical sense, what would a post-liberal government look like?
So that's a pretty good question. And like I said, post liberalism, probably the hallmark of it would be Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. And he offers no concrete example of what this post liberal world would end up resembling. Now, I've sort of theorized one possibility being a basically an issue that we have in the United States is we have no shared system of morality. It's kind of a free for all right now, and the reason for part of the reason for that is we have a separation of church and state. So the idea is that the government should not be the source of morality, that there shouldn't be a central authority that promulgates a shared sort of system of ethics and morality. So one way that I could see a post-liberal society to emerge is for the state to basically take on the role of providing the shared system of morality. And one way that could be done is if, in, for example, something like a constitution, if we basically laid out that these are the virtues that we recognize and are considered valid, and will therefore form the basis of a new shared morality.
Okay, but of course, as you know, there are it's not a there are different ideas on what these values exactly should be. And there are also some people that believe that these can be objectively derived in some ways. So what do you do about people who disagree?
So the issue of people, so right now we have, it's basically a type of moral nihilism. And for a lot of reasons, I don't have an easy solution on how we create a post-liberal society, because obviously any attempt to do something like that right now, you're going to run into issues, because the ruling administrative class of the United States is not going to agree to a morality that contradicts or gets in the way of their massive inequitable accumulation of wealth. So the way to, so in order to create a post-liberal society, there would need to be some sort of revolution or major change in our society in order for that to take place. And generally in moral philosophy, I would say that the post-liberals see two potential ways of this happening. One of them, it would be through what Nietzsche proposes as the rise of the Übermensch, or the overman, who is someone who is able to seize control of the productive capacity of both modus vivendi liberalism as well as progressive liberalism, and use it to create a new system of morality. The other possibility is that things just get so bad and so unstable that we end up going back and ushering in a renewal of classical versions of morality, of virtue ethics. And that would obviously be the what I would hope would be the way of creating a post-liberal society. But for things like that to happen, there would have to be a rise of dissatisfaction with the status quo, which I believe is starting to occur. But I can't exactly say that it's going to happen imminently.
So, are you in favor of a violent revolution under some circumstances?
Currently, I would not say I'm in favor of a violent revolution, because I don't see that as being successful. I can't say, if circumstances change radically, what my position would be. Personally, I've been reading some of Mencius Moldbug, and he posits he is not a post-liberal, by the way. He is a reactionary monarchist. So I don't really there are parts of his philosophy I find very interesting and useful, but I'm hardly a doctrinaire Mencius Moldbug.
Yes, I saw your video on that.
Right. So but he has this whole concept of, well, and if you're on the dissident right, which I'm not sure if post-liberal conservative would be considered part of that or not, but if you're like a reactionary like he is, you're definitely on the dissident right. He believes that it doesn't make sense to engage in political activism. So if you're like an alt-righter or a monarchist, or you have some like radical right-wing view, for you to do like a Charlottesville rally or something like that, like you're only going to create obstacles to yourself. You're going to go into the frame of your political opponent, the cathedral, the left-wing media, and they're going to use that against you. They're going to hang you up in a frame and be like, look at how ridiculous the right wing is. They believe in monarchy. They're racist, whatever.
Yeah, you're going to be cringe.
Yeah, you're not gonna portray yourself well. So what Moldbug says is what we should instead do is kind of withdraw from political activism. I mean, that doesn't mean you don't care about politics. Yeah, you still talk politics. You still network with people, especially other right-wing people, and you still discuss political ideas, but you do so from a position of being detached. And in hopes that eventually we'll develop this robust sort of conservative intellectual culture that when the neoliberals and the cathedral are, you know, at a certain point have just ruined the country and wrecked everything, then our conservative network will be in a position where we can convince our institutions that you ought to listen to us rather than them.
Okay. So let me ask you another question here. Do you think that the American Revolution was justified?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really. I'd have to do more research in it. I know, having read Moldbug, his answer to that would be absolutely not. And that's my most recent. I don't want to answer that question though, because I haven't really examined the other side of that sort of historical argument. I'd want to consult some sources that were more in favor of the revolutionaries before I pass judgment on that.
Okay. Yeah, I've done my own study into that kind of stuff anyway. But I think that's all the big questions that I've really had for you. Do you have any questions for me?
So what is, I guess, why did you want to interview me about post-liberalism?
Well, because okay, this is a bit of an anecdotal story. Um, I had seen some of your videos, and then I'm on a Discord where there's a number of political commentators, and someone had said, "Look at this guy; he's rising. Maybe somebody could grab him and have him on the show." And it wasn't my show; it was somebody else's show that someone was talking about. But I thought, well, it's always interesting to talk to someone about politics, to get to know people, to expand the circle of intellectual interaction. So the reason I decided to talk to you about post-liberalism is because it was a concept that I wasn't very familiar with, but that obviously seemed to be a big part of your channel. I think one of your social medias, you are referred to as post-liberal.
Yeah, I think that's my Twitter, which I kind of abandoned using. But yeah, I think I referred to myself as like post-liberalist or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So that's why I decided to interview on that topic, because I thought it was something that I didn't know too much about. So it would be interesting to get a bit of some info on that, because I personally had developed my own political ideology, and I'm very interested in different political ideologies, and how those work, and how those interact in an intellectual sphere.
Yeah, I'm not the first one to invent the idea of post-liberal conservatism. Again, I think although I'm not sure that Patrick Deneen would be the person who Patrick Deneen, by the way, is a professor at Notre Dame. And he wrote Why Liberalism Failed, which is kind of like the centerpiece behind post-liberalism. If you're interested in it, that would be the go-to book. Um, but I adopted it after reading that book. Now, at the end of the day, I'm always a pragmatist before I'm an ideologue. So if, for example, we started to we started trying to create this post-liberal society, and it just didn't work out. It ended up much worse off than our current society. Then it would be my position that we shouldn't just adhere to the ideology for purely ideological reasons. If we were
Yes.
to do that, we would be no different than the liberals or no
Yes,
different than the communists.
I think
Um,
I agree on that. This idea of the realism versus idealism, that we should try to conform first to our reality that we live in before we try to change things, instead of simply trying to conform reality to our ideas.
One important thing that I want to convey is that liberalism is just as capable of committing itself to the sort of dystopian things that, for example, communists were willing to do. And one comparison that I've made before is that, for example, in the Soviet Union, they implemented this collective farming that so that their agriculture would coincide with their ideology of communism. And as a result of that decision, millions of people starved to death. And I compare that to the liberal commitment that we see towards the US Mexican border being open. The borders, the ability to have goods trafficked between the United States and Mexico has created this condition going back, I don't know, 50, 60 years now, that's resulted in massive numbers of drugs pouring in from Mexico to the United States. If we just shut down that border and stopped cross border trade, we could end that entirely. And if you start looking at the number of people who have died in Mexico from drug cartels, the number of people who have died in the United States from drug overdoses, from crime, murders, and robberies related to the drug industry, and if you total them up over the last 60 years, and consider that this problem might be ongoing for who knows how long, you can see how an ideological commitment that our society makes to liberalism can just as easily lead to the deaths of millions of people, just like Soviet Union did with collective farming.
Certainly, I do agree. So, was there anything else that you wanted to ask me?
No, I didn't really come up with questions for you. Maybe I should have, but I did not.
That's fine. I'd like to say at this point that I am not a liberal, um, at least in any way that liberalism has been defined. So, in that sense, I do have a number of agreements with this idea of post liberalism, that obviously liberty is something that is useful in certain areas and in certain circumstances, and in the right conditions, it can lead to prosperity. But it we need to have this idea that the way in which we structure our society is also important, and that just letting people do everything they want individually with no virtue behind it and no structure is obviously going to lead to a sort of degeneration, in essence. And you, of course, talked about the sexual revolution, which I would argue is in favor of that degeneration, not only in a sense of a social criticism, where people say that various types of behavior aren't good, but also in an greater sense that we see certain types of crime increase, and and we see more broken homes and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, people on the left often like to point out that the United States is supposed to be the leader of the free world, but it incarcerates the highest number of people than any other country on earth, and even more so than communist China. And I sort of feel, well, that's not surprising at all. That's baked into the cake of liberalism. Liberalism reduces everything, every aspect of society and culture into a bimodal sort of system where you have a relationship between an autonomous individual in the state. And the individual is encouraged to do whatever they want. And when they anger the state, then they're punished for it. That's basically how our entire society is set up.
Yes, I think, in my view, a way to deal with a lot of problems is to structure society and to structure communities, and that the structure is going to either encourage certain types of behavior and discourage other types of behavior. And therefore, we need to understand that whenever we construct a government, that even if we aren't intentionally looking to structure the way people behave, the way that the government is structured will encourage and discourage certain behaviors, such as uh, Civil Rights Act, for example, which can encourage certain types of behavior and discourage other types of behavior unintentionally from the people that made the act, but it has led to certain problems coming from it.
Yeah, I believe that the Civil Rights Act is the cause of a lot of the racial unrest that we're experiencing right now. I don't think that it solved the issue of racism in our country. I believe that it made it far worse. And the reason I say that is because what the Civil Rights Act basically establishes is a presumption of discrimination on the part of institutions and employers. Now, the if you file a discrimination lawsuit against a school or a company, you do have to show a prima facie case. But satisfying the prima facie case is can just be as simple as established as simply as showing that you yourself are a minority. So if you're a black person suing for discrimination, then you've pretty much already made your prima facie case. So with that being done, the burden of proof then shifts on to the employer or the school or whoever's being sued to prove that they're not discriminating against the individual. So how do you possibly prove that you're not racist or you're not discriminating? Well, in order to prove that, you have to create evidence that shows that you're not racist. And that's where PC culture, woke culture comes from. All of these companies have to constantly create signs that they are not racist. It's why Nickelodeon, a television network for children, has to air an I Can't Breathe segment for 8 minutes or whatever, to honor the memory of George Floyd or whatever. They have to do this because otherwise they can be subject to this sort of grievance industry that goes after companies that aren't doing enough to show that they're not racist. And rather than help Black people, I think this actually hurts them because it creates this sense of entitlement that they don't need to, they can't do anything wrong. That cultivates a sort of narcissism on the part of the Black community. And I believe that is why we've seen so many problems with Black crime, with Black poverty, is this system just perpetuates itself.
Yes, that
If you were to take a time machine back to 1960, you would be shocked to learn that, or let me back that up. This is another Mencius Moldbug example that he says, which I think captures the issue very well. If you were from the 1960s and you took a time machine to the modern day and looked at how black people how they functioned in 1960 versus today, you would assume that the Ku Klux Klan must have taken over the government of the United States, because black people used to be pretty close to parity with whites. They used to get married before they had children. They, had a higher employment rate than white people. They didn't get in trouble with the police all of the time. And, they didn't have this sky high crime rate. And I largely blame that on primarily the Civil Rights Act and to a lesser extent the Great Society welfare programs.
Yes. So, what are your thoughts on abortion?
I think that abortion is immoral and wrong. I think that it's a form of murder. And I think the idea that the U.S. Constitution protects a right to an abortion is laughable. I compare our constitutional jurisprudence on the issue of abortion, transgender rights, gay rights as nothing but myth and legend, where the Supreme Court might as well be the head of America's mythology, because all of these court decisions that it keeps arriving at are not at all reflective of the text or reality of the Constitution. Now, the Roe v. Wade court decision is justified on the idea that the founding fathers would have supported a right to an abortion if they had been aware of the medical possibility of conducting an abortion. But this is not true. Abortion has always existed throughout human civilization. And you can find old trial transcripts online of people being tried for the crime of abortion from the 19th and 18th century, or sorry, 19th and 20th century. And the founding fathers would have been aware of abortion because they likely would have been familiar with Plato's Republic. Obviously, the founding fathers were heavily inspired by ancient philosophy. That's why all of our, like the Congress, the Supreme Court buildings, they were designed to look like ancient Greek buildings. And in Plato's Republic, there's I believe it's book 4, but I may be wrong about that. But there's this extended dialogue where Socrates is talking about how to create the perfect society, and he's specifically talking about gender. And Socrates proposes a radical gender egalitarian society where men and women freely have sex. The children are then, when a child is born, it's taken away from its mother and it's raised by the state bureaucracy with no knowledge of the child's parentage, who the child's parent is. And the Socrates also says that in such a society, abortion on demand and even infanticide on demand would be permitted, and the state would end up automatically aborting children of people deemed unfit to reproduce. So this idea of abortion would have been something that the founding fathers would have, had a conception of, yet they deliberately did not put any of Socrates' ideas about gender egalitarianism into the U.S. Constitution.
Yes, and it also would have been familiar to them from a Christian tradition as well, because it was something that, to my knowledge, had been discussed in the past as well, from that side of things as well. And of course, many of them had that kind of education that they would be familiar with that.
Yeah, the founding fathers received the true liberal education, which means they read the great books and they learned how to be good liberals and live their lives according to virtue. So they would have been familiar with that. And I agree that the abortion also contradicts the Christian traditions and morality as well.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's been great talking to you. You are obviously a man of some intellect, and I appreciate the videos that you make. I think that they're very thoughtful, very well researched. So, uh, toward that, I say thank you for allowing me this opportunity to interview you. If you'd ever like to talk again for whatever reason, I'd be very happy to do so. Um, is there
All
any?
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've enjoyed this conversation as well. If you want, if you're going to use this as a video or anything like that, just let me know and I can do a shout out for it in the discussion section of my channel.
Yes, I am going to be publishing this.
Okay. Yeah, just send me a link whenever you do, and I'll go ahead and direct some views to your channel.
Okay. So anyway, thanks. Thank you all. Thank you for coming on. Thank everybody for watching. If you have any questions, do leave comments in the comments section below, or feel free to contact us directly on any major issue. I think we would both agree that it's good to have an open discourse regarding these ideas and to be able to discuss things and to therefore also grow ourselves intellectually and also in the sense of our virtues and values. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time. Anavultus over and out.